The medieval tortures. It is a historical fact the Roman Catholic Church supplanted all civil authority of the European governments for exactly 1,260 years. And this began in the year 538 AD and ended in the year 1798 AD when Napoleon sent his general in to capture the Pope of Rome. The most common means of torture included burning, beating, and suffocating. However, the techniques below are some of the more extravagant and depraved methods used and allowed by the Roman Catholic Church. The iron gag or mute's bridle. This device stifles the scream so as not to disturb the conversation of torturers. The iron box on the inside of the ring is forced into the victim's mouth and the collar fastened behind their neck. A small hole allows the passage of air, but this can be stopped up by a touch of the executioner's fingertip, producing suffocation, often constructed with a long spike that pierced the tongue in the floor of the mouth, protruding from underneath the chin, while the other end penetrated up through the bony palate of the mouth into the sinuses. Often those condemned to the stake were thus gagged because their screams would interfere with the sacred pagan music played during the grandiose public festivities in which dozens of heretics were burnt at one time. The pendulum, a fundamental torture, one that is often just a preparation of the victim for more effective infliction of still more tortures. No complex equipment is needed. The victim's wrists are tied behind his back, then a rope is attached to the wrist restraints, and the sufferer is slowly hoisted up, ripping the humerus from the sockets and dislocating the scapula and clavicle. The agony can be heightened by means of weights progressively attached to the feet until at last the skeleton is pulled apart as it is by the bench and the ladder racks. The rack. The rack was an instrument of torture often used in the Middle Ages and a popular means of extracting confession. The victim was tied across a board by their ankles and wrists. Rollers at either end of the board were turned by pulling the body in opposite directions until dislocation of every joint occurred. According to Puget-Blanche, quoted in Mason's History of the Inquisition, in this attitude he experienced 8 strong contortions in his limbs, namely 2 of the fleshy parts of the arms above the elbows and 2 below, 1 on each thigh and also on the legs. Bound, the heretic could then be subjected to other forms of torture. And just to note, the rack was extensively used during the Spanish Inquisition. Other forms included the detainee being fastened in a groove upon a table on his or her back. Suspended above was a gigantic pendulum, the ball of which had a sharp edge on the lower section, and the pendulum lengthened with every stroke. The victim sees this engine of destruction swinging to and fro only a short distance from one's eyes. Momentarily, the keen edge comes nearer, and at length cuts the skin, and gradually cuts deeper and deeper until their life has fully expired. The ladder rack. Preparation for the ladder rack often started with the crushing of the shins with the screw-activated Spanish boots. With the arms securely affixed behind the victim's back, the person was then put onto the inclined slope of the ladder rack. Thus low, the executioner would push the 2 heels of the feet forward, causing the victim to plummet downward, so that the shoulders were immediately and violently wrenched out of their sockets. The victim is literally stretched by force of the winch, with various old sources testified to increase of 12 inches that comes from the dislocation and extrusion of every joint in the arms and legs, of the dismemberment of the spinal column, and of course the ripping and detachment of the muscles of limbs, thorax and abdomen. But long before the victim is brought to the final undoing, he or she, even in the initial phases of the inquiry, suffers dislocation of the shoulders because his arms are pulled up behind his back, as well as the agony of muscles ripping like any fiber subjected to excessive stress. In the question of the second degree, the knee, hip, and elbow joints begin to be forced out of their sockets. With the third degree, they separate very audibly. After only the second degree, the sufferer is maimed for life. After the third, he is dismembered and paralyzed, and gradually over hours and days the life functions cease one by one. The stocks. The victim with his or her hands and feet locked into the pertinent holes with bracket irons was then set out in a square where the mob, in the mildest of cases, poked him, slapped him, and besmirched him with feces and urine, or substances supplied by the ubiquitous chamber pots or open jakes. All of these were smeared into the mouth, ears, nose, and hair. Only the most noxious transgressors could hope to get away with no more than a few black and blue marks and a couple of bumps. Children's books, cinema, and television generally portray the stock in humorous colors, centered on a grumpy victim being cajoled and reviled by an always benevolent, rough and tumble crowd. Reality was very different. With their feet in the stocks, two pieces of timber clamped together, over and under, both across each leg above the ankles. The soles of their feet, then having been greased with lard, a blazing brazier was applied to them, and they were first blistered and then fried. At intervals, a board was interposed between the fire and their feet, and removed once they disobeyed the command to confess themselves of guilt for which they had been charged. Being more painful but less fatal than racking, this was a torture most in vogue when the subject chanced to be of the female sex. It was also favored in cases where children were to be persuaded to testify against their parents. Slaughter tortures consisted of binding a piece of iron to a limb and putting a twister mark to force it inwards, as was pressing the fingers with rods between them, or removing a nail from fingers or toes, which were all highly practiced until persons of not sufficient strength to survive the pulley, rack, or fire. The barrel pillory, inflicted for the most part on chronic drunkards who were exposed to public ridicule in this fashion. The barrels could be either of two kinds, those closed on the bottom with the victim immersed in feces and urine, or merely putrid water, or open so that the victim could walk and be led about the town with the enormous and very painful weight on their shoulders. Water torture. The victim's nostrils were pinched shut, and 8 quarts of fluid were poured down the victim's throat through a funnel. Other techniques included forcing a cloth down the throat, while pouring water which made a swallowing reflex, pushing it further down into the stomach, producing all the agonies of suffocation by drowning until the victim lost consciousness. Instead of water, the torture was sometimes conducted with boiling water or vinegar. And it sounds an awful lot, dear ones, like what the CIA uses as waterboarding. So Rome's torture methods have infiltrated this whole world, and especially the U.S. police force and government. The Heretics Fork. This instrument consisted of 2 little forks, one set against the other, with the 4 prongs plunged into the flesh, under the chin and above the chest, with hands secured firmly behind their backs. A small collar supported the instrument in such a manner that the victims were usually forced to hold their head erect, thus preventing any movement. The forks did not penetrate any vital points, and thus suffering was prolonged and death was always nearly avoided. The pointed prongs on each end to the crane, the person's head made speech or movement near impossible. The Heretics Fork was very common during the height of the Spanish Inquisition. The pear. These instruments were used in oral and rectal formats, like the present specimen, and in the larger vaginal one. They are forced into the mouth, rectum, or vagina of the victim, and there expanded by force of the screw to the maximum aperture of the segment.